The Madness, a memoir of war, fear and PTSD by the BBC's Fergal Keane. He was a Bafta-winning war reporter for decades, bringing people the stories of life and death, conflict and brutality from the hottest of the world's hotspots, including Rwanda, Sudan, South Africa, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan and Ukraine. But this book is about his own trauma, his acute, complex post-traumatic stress disorder acquired from witnessing horrific scenes during his career. The Madness is out now in paperback. Welcome to the programme, Fergal Keane.
Thank you, Hugo.
Thanks very much for being with us. Look, to what extent is your reporting on the genocide in Rwanda the keystone to this story?
I think it's it's absolutely critical. I had covered, quite a bit of violence before that. I'd been in Northern Ireland, living there during the Troubles, then to South Africa, covering the transition to democracy there, and seen some pretty nasty things. But nothing prepared me for the immensity of genocide. And it is called the crime of crimes for a very good reason, because I think what I felt, in what I witnessed there and what I had to think about when I came back and what I still think about is the idea that you can just try to wipe a people off the face of the earth. It goes to the heart of the sort of the dark part of the darkest part of the human condition, and that germ, for all the promises that were made after the Holocaust, that germ was rampant in Rwanda, and it is infinitely possible again today in different parts of the world. We haven't learned, and that's the hardest thing, I think, for me. They talk about moral injury, and I think that, as much as PTSD, with its nightmares, its hypervigilance, its depressions, but the kind of moral injury, that sense that human beings are capable of absolutely anything, that they're capable of in our time, targeting people solely on the basis of their ethnicity and trying to wipe them off the face of the earth. Well, I wasn't ready for that.
When we talk about PTSD, then, talk us through what it means. To what extent are we talking about trauma experienced at a particular time that doesn't go away? And to what extent are we talking about something that manifests sort of afterwards?
Yeah, I think in my case, it's quite, mine is not to be special and different, because there are many commonalities in people's experience of PTSD. But in mine, it began as a kid growing up in an alcoholic home, which was full of uncertainty, which, anything could happen and usually did. And that somewhat rather perversely prepared me for a life in war zones. I learned very young how to read the situation, how to read the temper of a room, and that came in very handy at roadblocks, dealing with 16-year-old militiamen with machetes and AK-47s. So I was prepared, but in terms of the symptoms which manifested themselves, it took years later. Really, I think I was having nightmares post Rwanda, but the first really big breakdown came in 2008, and the first hospitalization.
And to what extent could you connect that at the time with the experiences the things you'd witnessed and the experiences you'd been through?
Very, very easily. I became paranoid. I began to think people were going to track me down and kill me. I began to have the most horrific nightmares in which, I was taken back there. I was seeing incidents played out in my head, and began irrationally to fear for my safety. And a panic gradually built and built and built to the point where I no longer felt safe, and committal to a psychiatric hospital was imperative.
To what extent with PTSD, particularly for someone in your position, particularly for someone for a war reporter, to what extent is PTSD? Is there a sort of a guilt inherent in PTSD? Because PTSD is a trauma that's inflicted upon you when you have witnessed horrific traumas inflicted upon other people, and obviously with everybody it is the self that dominates. That must just sort of make it a spiraling, increasingly difficult thing to process and deal with.
It does, because you say to yourself, well, there are two levels to that. One is, who the heck am I to complain?
Yeah.
I got on a plane and I got out of the place. I'm well paid. I get awards for doing this stuff. People tell me what a wonderful chap I am, how compassionate you are, how brave you are. And you think to yourself, that's bullshit. If you knew the real me, You wouldn't think that. And the real me, part of the real me was someone who was chasing the affirmation, the applause, the pat on the back, and who was addicted to it. And, had it been a question of, addiction to drugs, or nobody's going to pat me on the back and say, oh, that was a great overdose you did, but if you're covering a massacre or covering a genocide, they will pat you on the back and say, oh, fantastic, great work. So it's a very permissive environment in that sense. And then the other issue was that the guilt you felt leaving people, walking away, and in one case in Rwanda, with it pretty certain that they were going to be killed, and you leave. Now, I can, give you all the sort of intellectual rationalization for that. That we were under threat ourselves, that we had to get out and tell the story, and that's all true. But there is part of me that knows that I just didn't have the guts. I was too afraid to stay in that place and stand in the way of murderous genocidal killers. And that stays with you. And then it was most acute in Rwanda, but my God, there's so many times before and since where I've been with people who are suffering and then walked away. And that sense that you are commodifying their suffering into 3.5, 4 minutes for the 10 o'clock news.
Well, I mean,
it's part of what we do, and it's part of what reporters on the Times do, and that's the job we do. But
it's the nature of journalism. It's to some extent what I'm doing with your PTSD right now on my radio show. It's how we present the message.
It is.
How much can you disentangle the PTSD you suffered, the trauma you suffered from these experiences, and the addiction to repeating them? Is the addiction to repeating them a way of just another way of processing the trauma of the experiences in the first place?
Yeah, I think it's acting out trauma. I think it's a very good way of putting it. It's so the acting out of previous traumatic experiences and keeping yourself going back and back and back. And stopping that has been incredibly difficult. I mean, in a way, giving up drinking was easier. I was a full-on alcoholic. And I quit that 24 years ago now. And that was easier because it's, you can put down a drink and say, that's it. Okay. And you can get all sorts of help and friends and that who'll help you through that process. But putting down the job that you love fully and completely is a very different thing. It's, and because it's not so clear cut. You can say, well, I'm not going to go to a war zone, but does that mean I will never cover the subject of war again? Talk to veterans and talk to refugees. And how much would that potentially traumatize me if I kept doing it? And right now I'm in a kind of in-between stage. I'm not, I'm sort of that sort of Augustinian progress. Make me perfect, but not just yet.
Is there a commonality among war correspondents in your experience? Are there things they have in common? Are they a particular kind of person? Do they often have some kind of trauma in their past, like your similar childhood trauma? Is there something that drives people to do that kind of gig?
I think look, I haven't done a kind of I'm going on anecdotal evidence, but I think very often I've encountered people who've had some kind of disruption in childhood. Not all as dramatic as a kind of alcoholic home, but people whose parents have split or who've been, had to travel around the world or separated from their parents for different reasons. I think there's a lot to be found in childhood. And I certainly know from people who've written to me since the book was published, some very senior correspondents who are friends of mine, competitors of mine, who have, described their experience. And I think particularly around the pressure to keep delivering, to keep being the one who's on the front line, who's doing dramatic stories, who's being praised, who's, as I was, and possibly still am a bit, addicted to the drug of affirmation,
What's the process by which you and one can work their way out of PTSD? What does the therapy involve? What do the changed behaviors involve?
I think being brutally self-honest. That's for me where it started. Looking at my weaknesses, looking at what it is that drives me, and trying to counter that, and listening to the people who love you. Listening to family, and recognizing the impact that your actions have on them, and doing that on a daily basis. And this is where I think, for me, the experience of having given up alcohol helps, because I am bringing the kind of tools of what I talk about, that kind of, really doing an inventory on myself at the end of every day and saying, were you an arse today, the way you behave towards people? But no, it's true, putting it quite bluntly, because, a lot of what goes with the job that I have done is an outsized ego. Okay. And some display it in the kind of bombastic, knocking other people over way. Others display it in a quieter fashion, like me. So, how can I, the appearance of humility, and underlying it a ruthless determination.
Yeah, but that is that.
And it's calling that out and saying it publicly, like I'm saying it now. That will keep me straight. That will keep me alive.
That is tremendous self-knowledge. Yeah, I mean, you're look. You say your therapist also helped you overcome the thought that you could or should have done more to save people in war zones when you covered them. How does one conquer that feeling? I mean, can one ever completely conquer that feeling? But what's the process you can use to do that?
I think you have to say to yourself, it's being rational, okay, and not indulging the great sort of melancholy, tragic gene that I have, and which has bled into my reporting on occasions, not always helpfully. And so it's been tough with myself, but to use that awful psychobabble phrase, tough love with the self. It's saying, look, be realistic. There's nothing you could have done. And to say otherwise is a kind of narcissistic guilt. It's a different expression of the same old problem inside me.
Yeah. No, understood. Well, look, we've got to leave it there, but thank you very much indeed, Fergal Keane. A great pleasure to speak to you.
Thank you.
A real pleasure, and fascinating too. And The Madness, a memoir of war, fear, and PTSD, is out in paperback now. As we